My name's Rosemary. I'm a product manager. For the last 8 years, I have worked in New York at several startups and a consultancy called Pivotal Labs. I came over to London to found the product practice for Pivotal Labs here. I went freelance in August and worked with a startup called Remote Year, and then have recently joined Mind the Product as the director of training products. So they have pulled me in to help build their training business and figure out ways in which we can scale training to a global platform, which will be exciting. But I'm here to talk about experiences that I've had with slightly more traditional software development processes, particularly ones where you have at least a group, if not a large group of stakeholders, and you're attempting to create a product from a greenfield perspective, aka you have kind of a vague idea as to what you think you want to build, what you think you want to solve, and you're trying to figure that out through research and framing and testing. And I'm talking very specifically about the situation around communication of that research and what it is that you're finding and how to optimize to make sure that everyone's on the same page. I found that this is one of the most important things to do, because if you don't, no matter how much research you do, you kind of end up having to justify yourself in a way that doesn't feel quite appropriate. And occasionally it means that all of the work and investment that you've made in the research to figure out the right problem and the right solution for it based off of user needs can sometimes go in the bin. And that's what we're attempting to avoid. We want that work to kind of come to bear on the product itself. So we all can probably agree that collaboration leads to innovation, in that creating diverse groups of teams with lots of different types of skill sets and very specific perspectives and different knowledge verticals of an organization can be very helpful for creating great tension. You want that sort of creative capacity to dissent or to throw out different solutions. And in order to do that, you need to be able to speak honestly. You need, again, diverse perspectives. You need that in-depth knowledge. You need support. You need empowerment. And by that, I mean, in certain respects, a slice of psychological safety. People have to know that it's okay for them to have differing opinions, and that people will treat each other with respect as you talk those opinions through. And you need transparency. You need to be able to speak honestly about what's working, what's not, how things are sort of going in the organization as a whole, and windows into larger vision and strategy. So transparency plus diverse individuals multiplied by skills, subtracting bullshit, equals collaboration. But what does collaboration create, really? Why are we trying to collaborate with each other? What are we looking to build? Can't each person kind of do their work and then sort of toss it over the wall? Unfortunately, no. Collaboration and getting folks into a room to share discussions, as well as share brainstorming and opportunities to talk about compromise and reflect on what you've learned, is the process of creating shared knowledge. And shared knowledge is when folks on a different team, whether they're part of the core team or part of the larger organization, come to accept foundational aspects of your product. So we're talking about everyone aligns along the problem statement. Everyone understands the goals that you're attempting to accomplish. Everyone agrees on the two target customer or customer segments that you're attempting to serve, and understands the implications of these agreements. That's what shared knowledge is. So collaboration plus research equals shared knowledge. So when you kind of put these two things together, you get participation and attention, you're going to create a group of people who can say, yeah, we've all sort of come to accept these certain foundational truths. Now, what you get when you have a group of people who have all worked towards those aspects is decision speed decreases, aka it takes less time for everyone to say this is the right path forward, whether that be setting your product roadmap, agreeing on what the vision is, understanding how you're going to approach strategy, Decreasing decision speed means that you guys, as product managers, can get products out to your customers faster. And ultimately, that's what you're looking to do. You want to be able to really test your product in the wild, and in order to get it out there into production, you need to be able to make decisions quickly. So we all know that product managers love something quite specific. We love control. We have a lot of moving parts in our jobs. There's lots and lots of different pieces of information that we have to take in. There's lots of spinning plates that we have to keep track of. And again, because we sit in the middle of that Venn diagram of design, business, and technology, we do really have to sort of chat with lots and lots of people. And so that means that controlling sort of what's happening in our brain and making sure that we have a really clear idea as to what's coming next is very important for us and our role. But, and so we do things like we own the backlog, we write the stories, we set the priority, we tell people not yet, or that's probably not going to work, or based off of our research, we're not necessarily seeing that as a possible solution, etc. So, but unfortunately, we work in ecosystems. We work in organizations where there are many different departments or individuals who are vying for resources, who are making sure that they have clear routes and clear pathways. And sometimes the process of them sort of brushing off their runway can kick a lot of stuff onto yours. So we don't exist in a beautiful build, measure, learn bubble. We have to be able to kind of accommodate and work with the individuals who are also part of our organization. Sad face. It's very sad. It is sad, but it's a reality that we all have to accept. And this is the thing that I really want to talk about today, which is these communication skills, which some people refer to as soft skills, but I think that's a bit of a misnomer because these are extremely hard skills to get good at. Communication skills are not just kind of things that PMs have to do every once in a while outside of their core capabilities. It is a baked-in part of every single task that the PM has to do on a daily basis. So it is the PM's responsibility to start creating relationships with stakeholders early and checking in on those relationships often. It is part of the PM's responsibility to create transparency into the research process and make sure that people have access to what work is going on and what it is that you're finding out and the impact of those insights. And it is the PM's responsibility to get the individuals who are part of the organization involved as the team builds the product vision. If the product manager accomplishes some or all of those tasks, then you should not hear a stakeholder say this phrase. But show of hands, has anyone here heard a stakeholder say this phrase? Yeah, there's usually a few hands. It's a terrible thing to hear because one, it invalidates the actual work that you've done, and it also invalidates the work that you do. It indicates to me a stakeholder who basically fundamentally misunderstands how user insights can add so much value to de-risking products. So it's oftentimes very difficult to understand how to react when you hear this phrase. But this phrase is actually slightly more positive than another really negative indicator in terms of your stakeholder relationships, which is silence, like not getting any feedback at all. And this happened to me quite recently on a research contract that I was doing. And I was working alone. They had hired me as the sole researcher and PM. And we were all remotely located, and I had a very hard time getting attention and getting people on the phone with me, etc. And I kind of assumed that this meant that whatever I put forward at the end in terms of the vision was going to be accepted. Now, unfortunately, I hate to tell you that that was absolutely not the case. And when I did present the product vision, it turned out to be quite controversial and ended up being a much larger discussion. So ultimately, kind of what these situations boil down to is when you don't have participation of your stakeholders within the research activities, then what you become is an individual who, despite having lots of evidence and data to back up the decisions that you've made, you're perceived to be simply another person with an opinion. And when you get into opinion fights with hippos, which are the highest paid opinions, or potentially the opinions that outrank you in an organization, then you tend to lose. And that's an incredibly frustrating thing, especially if you've really poured a lot of time and effort into gathering valuable insights. But unfortunately, if you don't have those collaborations, if you haven't created that shared knowledge at incremental parts of the discovery process, then there's not much you can do in order to sort of negate this perception. So the other thing I'll also say is we've been looking at this from quite a negative aspect. There's a really positive perspective on bringing stakeholders into the room early and often, and it can be a lot of fun. We've talked a lot about stakeholders sort of having biases and assumptions about solutions or about the process, but they also have a lot of really helpful things. They have deep organizational knowledge. They run their departments or they participate in their departments, and they can hold a lot of things in their brain that you might want to access but not necessarily have to learn from the ground up. So they can save you a lot of time in terms of context building. They understand strategy from different perspectives. They set process with their employees and in their department, and they have resources that might be really, really helpful if you could have percentages of those personnel. So it's really, really, really helpful to have stakeholders involved and can take a lot off of your plate. So when I talk about stakeholders, who am I discussing? I think that it really is a bit of a unique snowflake conundrum. It depends on the organization, it depends on the product. But oftentimes you tend to need more people at the beginning as you're kicking off. And then maybe you sort of narrow down to sort of a core group of stakeholders who come in for certain activities. And that might expand if you did sort of like a big pivot or decided that you were going to add on, or you kind of came to an inflection point. So you sort of see like the stakeholder group occasionally grow and contract depending on what part of the product life cycle you are in. But you want to be really mindful of who you need, and for the most part default to having someone involved as opposed to not, because oftentimes it's the exclusion of people that's more harmful than potentially including them. And I have had situations where I've had meetings where there have been like 35 people sitting around the room. You do have to kind of establish some ground rules as to how this is going to be productive for folks, set expectations as to what's going to happen. But just having people listen to conversations in real time is very helpful. So when do you need them? I keep saying sort of incrementally, start early and often, but what do I mean by that? Let's get a little specific. So I often do kickoff meetings when I'm doing discovery. It's an opportunity for us to align on problem statement and the intended goals. I love bringing stakeholders into at least 1 or 2 user interviews, like in person, as my note takers or potentially on the phone. But it's very difficult to, and can oftentimes really be an eye-opening experience for stakeholders to listen to feedback directly from users in the context of a formal, structured user interview. That these aren't just easy-peasy conversations, but you're looking at this from a scientific aspect, and you're really thinking about the work that you're doing, and it helps them value what it is that you do. Synthesize exercises are absolutely wonderful, and I think some of the most valuable times when you can bring stakeholders in, because it's their opportunity, even if they didn't listen to the user interview, to really sound off on the pieces of feedback, put their fingerprints on it, give their perspective on the value, get involved in the ideation process, and really kind of get a sense of the themes that are emerging in terms of user needs. So they can be a lot of fun, they're quite dynamic, and I've really enjoyed having stakeholders in them. And then design studios are great, it gets them drawing, it gives them lots of transparent insight into how sort of the ideation process works. And then regular stand-ups, debrief meetings, I kind of try to do weekly ones. Anytime you're really cooking on the creation of the product, I think demos can be very helpful. Oftentimes, if you're sort of like leading into a release, having regular release meetings can be really, really helpful. But you're just looking to make sure that you have an opportunity to constantly sort of raise the work that you're doing, call out how things have changed, what's been updated, where risks are emergent, etc. And I just want to call out that it is about a group dynamic at times. It is very important to have one-on-one conversations with individuals. I often do stakeholder interviews with stakeholders at the beginning of projects just to understand their perspective. But I have at times had only one-on-one conversations with all of the stakeholders and thought to myself, gosh, I'm so covered. I've been talking to everyone. Only to have, like when group meetings arose or a couple days down the pipe, have lots of confusion about, wait, I thought you said this in the conversation I had with you, and now you've told Sam that you believe something else. So sometimes it's about getting people around a table so that you can see how they behave when they're confronted with their boss or their colleagues, because sometimes it can be quite difficult for them to speak up at certain points, and it can be great for you to facilitate that. So it's a balance between having the one-on-one conversations, but also making sure that you are getting people around a table. So all of this is wonderful, but a lot of people still say, I just can't seem to get folks' attention. I set meetings and no one shows up. I try to get people involved. I just can't seem to get on people's calendars. I'm just not getting the support. And I have been there and I empathize. So unfortunately, there are no easy answers to that question. There is no magic bullet. But when I find that I'm having trouble getting people's attention, I have to kind of dig my heels in a little bit, do some additional prep and kind of organizational stuff in order to get myself in a place where there are no barriers to entry of the stakeholders getting involved. So when I say get specific, I mean when you call a meeting, be able to outline the purpose of the meeting and have an agenda. So people understand what it is that they're going to be doing in that meeting and what they expect to contribute. Getting organized means getting these meetings on calendars early, making sure that you're constantly sort of looking ahead as to when you think you might need to be speaking to people and sectioning off time. Sometimes it'll change, but it's very helpful just to make sure that people are aware of the general time frame as to when you'll need to be checking in and when they can expect to need to participate. Being consistent is very helpful. Like I've had times where I've been very flaky because I've had to do lots of travel, or I'm constantly sort of trying to connect with different time zones, or I don't have an office and I'm sort of constantly working remotely. And that kind of does induce a bit of flakiness and I have to cancel calls or I don't show up on time. Or meetings fall off the calendar, these types of things. And that can be very, very detrimental because it sets the precedent that you are not to be trusted and may or may not value people's time. And so it sort of is this terrible catch-22 where the more you are sort of inconsistent and flaky, the less seriously people take you, and then they really don't show up. So making sure that you're there on time, prepared, don't let things fall off calendars, be on calls. Oops, computer died. Oh. And then the final thing is about raising the risk. Product managers, I think it takes a few years to really understand this, but you are leaders in your organization. Sometimes you're not particularly empowered leaders, but you are. And you have responsibilities and privileges within that role in terms of being able to say, we need a meeting. This is absolutely critical that we talk about this. There's too many sort of side conversations going on. No one's aligned, and we need to make sure that we're all, sort of set up to be successful. I told a product manager last week at a training in Amsterdam, I was like, you can call that meeting. You can do that. She was like, oh, okay. I will. And because there had been all kinds of one-on-one conversations going on around her, and she got handed a stack of work. that she's not happy with, and she feels frustrated and resentful. And I was like, a meeting with everyone around the table might have been very helpful in that circumstance. And she goes, next time I'll call one. It's okay for you to call those meetings and get people on a Skype call or get people in a conference room. Because it's a risk when people are not aligned. It's a risk if you don't understand if somebody is going to support the work, because that costs the organization money and your time. And it also presents the opportunity for you guys to build something that the customers are not going to want. If somebody comes in and says, no, you must build this, and just kind of derails your whole plan. So raising the risk is an inherent responsibility of a product manager, and being able to take steps in order to say, we're all in quite different places, we need to get together, is your responsibility as well. So with that, I say, please keep the door open. And if you happen to be a stakeholder in an organization and you are invited by a PM to participate in this type of work, I strongly encourage you to walk through it. And I think we have time for some questions, which I think is sort of the main intent of this talk. Thank you. So yeah, I'll open it up to questions and see if you guys have any sort of like discussion points or things you want to call out.
How do you manage a bonfire between two conflicting stakeholders?
I think definitely making sure that you've had opportunities to talk one-on-one with both of them is very helpful. Recognize kind of what their goals are, what their strategy is, and then also try to articulate with each of them where you feel like there are differences, but also try to draw out where there may also be commonalities. Because the difference in commonality thing, when you can establish those two things, frame the differences in non-aggressive language, and just sort of say like there are differences because X, Y, Z, and just keep it to facts as opposed to emotions, then that creates a runway towards empathy on both of their parts. And hopefully in establishing the commonalities, you might also be able to find some priorities between those two things that overlap and can rise to the top, and say, in doing this two things, then we are actually meeting goals for both of you. Then the next thing might serve this person more, but the next thing we do will definitely serve this person more. And so as a product manager, you can kind of say, okay, we've sort of risen the common priorities to the top. The next appropriate thing to build, would be X. And then you can also say, okay, because X really serves this department a little bit more, then we'll kind of compromise and say the next thing that we do. So it's all about that prioritization conversation. Just making sure that when you're saying not yet, they don't take it as saying no. But I think it's really helpful to understand how you can kind of find alignment. Does that help? It's hard with not a ton of context.
Well, for an organization where I can say that the commercial team and the operation team sort of talk to each other, the technology team tend to work in a silo. We believe that their strategy is different from the rest of the business. When you build things and you have a roadmap, you sort of suddenly have like the IT team comes in and they are stakeholder, they have a different priority. And then they come in and go like, why are you not prioritizing my needs? Whereas the operation team have a different stake. So you get them together in a room, they have a fight. You tackle them one-on-one, they yell at you and saying that they are the highest priority, they are the highest priority because they're the most important people in the business. So it's managing that dynamics.
Yeah.
That's the most challenging.
Yeah. It sounds like it could potentially be helpful to try to pull people from IT and operations into meetings earlier, because if you've sort of gotten to a point where you've set a vision and then IT sort of storms in and goes, why aren't you prioritizing our stuff? It sounds like they maybe needed to be part of the conversation a little bit sooner as well. And I think that sometimes that can be really difficult for product and design to remember, is that it's always helpful to have engineering representatives in the room from day one. And that's something that can be really difficult, especially when they're working on things. They might not necessarily be allowed off projects. I've constantly demanded engineers be part of research and discovery. And sometimes I get, a percentage of a person's time, and sometimes I don't get any, and sometimes I get them for the whole thing. So it really depends, but make sure that you ask and keep asking, because participation of engineering is really critical and can be so helpful moving forward. Did you have a question?
Just to add, it's not a question, it's just to add maybe a feeling to what you just said. You said that engineers doesn't come early.
They're not usually allowed to participate in research.
From the business who put that restriction.
Of course, and business puts most of these restrictions.
But I think sometimes, from an engineering point of view, I would say that sometimes you're not interested in political discussion where you're not stakeholder of any decision.
I'm not talking about political discussions. I'm talking about research.
Let's rephrase it.
Okay.
Then. In research, in corporates or in more structured environments, any decision that might take there, it's discovery, it's learning, but might be commits or might be used as later on when the project fails. You say that and you say you promised us something and we took it for granted and you didn't deliver that. So it cannot be political. Maybe I'm going too far.
I'm not sure. I think the thing is that in research, everything is a test and an assumption that you're looking to validate. Like that's how I frame it with my stakeholders. So if we sort of find evidence, whether it be qualitative or quantitative evidence, hopefully a combination of the two on any question that we're asking, then there's usually a strong indication that there's going to be value there. Now, that's not 100% of, like, you could do all of this amazing preparation work and still have features that, I'm not to be entirely honest, I'm not exactly sure the question that you're asking or the comment, like sort of what the intention of the comment is.
Sometimes as engineers, you don't feel interested in early discussion.
Right.
Because you don't
I have to agree to disagree. I mean, I've never found there to be a negative reaction from engineers if they're brought into the process early. If you're doing sort of lean research and user interviews, like having engineers involved, I think is always a benefit. Whether it be boring to the engineer, sometimes a lot of work is boring, but it's also necessary. And I think that it's really, really helpful to have engineers involved. So. That's just my opinion. I might be misunderstanding you, and if I am, I apologize. But I'm not. I think the main intention of this talk is, yes, there can be a lot of really pointless political discussions that they can be really shitty, and oftentimes have nothing to do with the work that you're actually trying to accomplish. I guess I'm really trying to drive product managers who are able to do research and discovery to make sure that the stakeholders are involved in that, outside of whatever political discussions may or may not be going on. Try to drive the focus and the intention towards, yes, you guys might be fighting, you guys might be embroiled in your opinion fights about what's right versus wrong. I have a lot of hard, concrete evidence as to what we should be building that I think is going to de-risk a lot of these assumptions, and I'd like everyone to pay attention to it and comment on it. Political discussions can kind of stay at the door.
On that note, how do you actually create a forum that is based on objective discussions and objective, what kind of model you use to sort of frame objective discussions? Yeah.
So I think there's a couple of sort of flash words that I kind of spout off a lot at these points, which is goals, problem statements, assumptions, proven value, and evidence-driven decisions. So you have to agree on the problem that you guys think you're trying to solve, and sometimes that's not as easy as it sounds. You have to have a list of prioritized goals that everyone can look at and say they're happy with. It's helpful for the group to be aware of the main assumptions that exist that are causing a lot of risk. So for instance, I was working on a delivery app for a grocery store, and the biggest assumption that we needed to validate was whether or not we could get a grocery list, shop it, and deliver it in 1 hour. That was the big assumption that we had to figure out. And so that was what was surfaced, and that's what was tested, and we were able to sort of prove that it was possible. And then sort of moving on from that, it's doing the research so that there are reasons why you've got features prioritized. We've got features prioritized because this tested particularly well with the prototype. We're doing a tweak to this feature because all of our data indicates that this is where people fall off when we're trying to convert them. And some prototype testing indicated that this would improve the situation. So you're not just kind of coming in and being like, I have a hunch or a gut feeling. You have all kinds of whys and evidence that back up the reason why you want to do that work. And that can be very powerful, as long as you can surface it. I also like creating like big visuals of the research that I've done and just kind of surrounding people in it, because it's very difficult for them to ignore it when it's literally sort of like stacking the walls. So that can also be very helpful as well.
So are you trying to find the data by talking to people?
Yes.
So it's validating the assumptions.
Mm-hmm. But there's a balance between qualitative and quantitative. So you usually start off, if you have access to macro level data sets, by asking big questions about potential market size, how many users might be interested in this, where are people seeing challenges, where would we like to increase engagement within the website or the app. So those are helpful framing using qualitative data, so big data sets. And then once you have some indication from the quantitative data, then you can kind of do your in-depth user interviews and sort of ask people the why.
So you're doing the value chain analysis sort of thing.
Value chain analysis would be one way to characterize it, but I never use that phrase.
We design things and we use the value chain. So everybody in the chain needs to agree that we are making assumptions and this is where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody had interest or
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really appropriate way to characterize it. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Value chain. Yeah. That's interesting.
I normally give an example. When they used to have a PC builder. They have chain like Microsoft, the chip maker, hardware. They all have the interest in the product.
Mm-hmm.
But they need to be able to go where or consult that we're buying these parts to build this PC. And these are all the people in the value chain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
They will be making money from it.
Of course. Yeah. That makes perfect sense.
Stakeholders,
Yeah. Sorry, you had a question?
What about the role of business analyst and how they should work together with project manager? What are roles? What are responsibilities? How do you see it?
I can't really characterize that because I've never worked with a business analyst. So unfortunately, I'm not entirely aware of the bounds of the role. But from my understanding of it, business analysts are obviously really, checking out all of the potential impact of changes of a product on the business and what you need from the business, what knowledge you need from the business in order to make sure that that feature is correct in certain respects. So obviously business analysts would need a very prominent seat at the table in terms of the conversations. And you would just need to make sure that they were well prepared in terms of whatever work was coming up next. But yeah, I mean, if they're a prominent member of the team, then they need to be viewed as such and included in most major conversations, I would expect. Hopefully they're sitting in the room with your product team and participating on a daily basis with the work that's happening. That's what I would recommend. Yeah.
When it comes to interviewing with stakeholders in the room, so bringing stakeholders along on interviews, how do you keep them from leading the interview, leading the interview?
Give them the role of silent note taker. And you can kind of establish a couple of things about a typical user interview, which is that this is not just a chit chat. We want it to feel like a conversation with the person who we're interviewing, with the subject. But we are attempting to sort of structure the interview from a scientific methodology. And I have thought about the questions that I will be asking quite carefully. And we have very specific goals that we're really trying to drive towards. So I'd like you listening in the room. It's critical that you kind of transcribe as much of the interview as possible, because that keeps them listening, to have the note taker thing. if you feel like there's a question you would like to ask, you can write it down and pass it over to me, and I will ask it.
And that behavior is actually more.
Yes.
Okay.
But I have come from a rather privileged position when I am giving that feedback, because I usually was coming in as a consultant who was sort of like mantled with the like expert sort of thing. So, but I also recommend for product managers to recognize the skills and expertise that you bring to a team. Like, sorry, Larry from accounting may or may not understand how to speak to someone, and I think you can just very much say, like, asking a question in a certain way biases the user and introduces information which taints our evidence and makes this basically a waste of time. So it's very expensive to bring these people in. It costs my time, your time, and usually a fee. And if you fuck my interview up, don't use that language.
I use that language all the time.
Fine, then use that language. Whatever works for you. If you mess up the interview, then you've just wasted around 300 pounds. And so introducing information or asking a subject question the wrong way basically means that this becomes unusable. So like, take it seriously. It's a serious thing. And I've had people come in and ruin interviews. And I've called them out on it literally right after. It's like, we can no longer assess the feedback that we've just gotten from that person in a way that's valid. So next time, I expect you to take this seriously and not wreck it. Thanks. It's hard. I mean, this kind of thing is hard. And I think the thing that PMs, and I'm really empathetic towards this because I started off from obviously a very junior point, everyone does. And the thing about stakeholder participation and helping people sort of acknowledge what your role is oftentimes means that you have to start standing up for your role. And just sort of establishing yourself as a person who like knows what you're talking about, and says, no, that's not the way that this is going to work. Very scary, very, very scary, but also very necessary if you're going to try to push towards a user-driven process.
It's an absolute blast. There was one woman who teaches basic product management in CSPO who says product management takes courage.
It does. It takes a lot of courage and integrity.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, in the situations that we've encountered, to de-risk at the moment, video the interview, but keep the stakeholder out of the room.
It's not a bad shout. I have oftentimes had them on conference calls. Like if I am worried that they're a bit of a live wire, I dial them in and say, put yourself on mute and just listen. Though you're very right. I am very careful about which stakeholders I bring in the room, because I mean, the one time the guy did sort of derail it, I had told him like 7 times how it was going to work, and he still didn't listen to me. And so I was like, you will now dial in. You're not allowed in the room. I'm sorry. Yeah. So dialing in is perfectly fine, as long as they actually listen. If they're on their phones like this the whole time, well, they're lost, I guess. But yeah, it's again, like, calling this type of aspect of your job soft skills, I think, is a real misnomer, because it is the hardest part of the job, and you really start grappling with it as you become more and more advanced. So you think you've learned a lot, you think you're sort of like progressing and moving forward in your career, and then you kind of start getting hit with a lot of these like really crappy situations, and it can be really tricky to navigate. But yes, courage is sort of the word of the day. You know, you have to be able to stand up. And a lot of the misunderstandings, I think, come from a basic misunderstanding or lack of knowledge about what the PM role does, or what a user experience designer does, or what user research is. And so educating folks and trying to set expectations up front can be massively helpful as well. Cool. Well, I hope that this was helpful. Are there any other questions? I think we still have time, don't we?
A few minutes, like 4 minutes.
4 minutes? One last question?
Thank you. How do you convey the benefits of user research to a stakeholder that's so against it?
I always talk about risk. It's all about risk. I mean, really, that's why you do all of this stuff. Like, I could, gut instinct and sort of basic knowledge of screen structures. Most people have enough that they could put together a product. But whether or not that product is going to work for people or serve a need is another. So, and then you invest, 12 months of development time, a couple £1 million, and you throw something out into the wild and it falls flat, and that's all wasted money. So when you talk about research, it's about we want to know that the thing that we release to our customers is going to earn us money, is going to not be a hit on our brand. I mean, when M&S's new retail site went up, like they took a massive credibility hit, as well as a huge hit on revenue for their online business for the next, I think, 2 quarters while they've sorted it out. So you don't want to be M&S. You want to be the company who sort of releases something that people go, even quietly, oh, that worked, or they don't even notice it, even if it doesn't come out with a big bang. You want to be able to provide value. So user research is about de-risking and making sure that you're building the right thing, so that you're not investing developer resources, which are your most expensive resource, in the wrong product. You know, and the big thing is that putting something into code and then having to rework it is twice as expensive as doing it right the first time. It's actually quadruple expensive sometimes because it can be really difficult to unpick stuff, especially when there are other things attached to it at that point. So yeah, it's all about, like, you know, it's easier for us to start off building the right thing than build the wrong thing and have to redo it. And that's basically what research prevents as much as possible.
As a developer, I would add to that's something very interesting. That's it's not well transmitted to managers and to a product manager. You can, as a developer, we can manage uncertainty. So if you say to us what you know and what you're not sure or what you want to be able to change, we might design the software in the way that something might be modular.
I think that is definitely correct, but unfortunately that type of mitigation is also very expensive and can sometimes lead to you guys over-engineering a solution that down the road we may not need that work. So yes, you can do that, but if I do research and am able to say to you with a little bit more certainty, this is the parameters of this and we're not going to expect to need XYZ, then it prevents you from sort of having to invest up front in certain things that potentially could not be used down the road, right? So, because I've had, like, when we really aren't sure, it's wonderful to be given the flexibility and know that I'm not going to be painted into a corner further down the road. What I hate is when somebody's invested all this time engineering solutions that never get used because we decide to go in a different direction. Does that make sense?
That exactly, we say the same thing.
Okay, perfect.
So we can easily develop uncertainty. So if we know the boundaries, then we can prioritize, we can work on the certainty, or make the uncertainty modular, and not invest too much.
And research sort of helps set those parameters much more clearly. You know, you can create parameters that are quite large, or you can create parameters that are slightly more specific. And what you're trying to do is just make sure that you really have a decent understanding of what to tell the engineers so that they don't necessarily feel like they have to kind of like go to the moon and back to not box you in if you go in a certain direction.
Or you have to onboard them on the same boats that you are. So I'm working, that's funny, I'm working on a 2-person startup. One day to another, I work like 3 weeks on the project, on functionalities, and like one day to another, we pivot. Totally different direction, 180, and let's start over again for 3 weeks. Because you have to manage uncertainty, but if you onboard the developer team within this, we're rephrasing exactly the same thing as before. If you onboard them with the certainty, uncertainty, so they perfectly know, as you are, of where they're going to, or what they don't know, and what they might discover, then they perfectly accept to do the turnaround.
Yeah, perfect.
It's personal experience.
Cool. Well, thank you guys so much. I hope that this was helpful. Cool. Enjoy the sunshine.